Liberty Nation. Truth is making a comeback.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation's LNTV. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. You may have noticed recently that talk of UFOs and government investigations into the aforementioned are moving more into the mainstream, with declassified Department of Defence videos being released, Trump's Space Force, and even places like the New York Times and Fox running segments on this. We decided to reach out to the expert in this field, former British Ministry of Defence investigator, Nick Pope. Thank you for being here, Nick.
Thank you, it's good to be on.
Nick, could you tell our viewers a little bit about your background and how you ended up being one of the leading authorities in the UFO arena?
Sure thing. I worked for the British government for 21 years at the Ministry of Defence, and I did a wide variety of different postings there, finishing up as an acting Deputy Director in the Directorate of Defence Security, so that was concerned with things like counter-terrorism. But the job that I'm best known for is actually one that I had for much of the early 90s when I ran the Ministry of Defence's UFO project.
And what did that actually involve?
Essentially, my job was to look at the phenomenon in its entirety, and specifically the 200 or 300 reports that we got each year sent to us at the Ministry of Defence, often by our own people, pilots, radar operators, and such like. And we had to investigate to determine whether there was evidence of any threat to the defence of the United Kingdom, or anything of more general defence or scientific interest.
To the best of your knowledge, what's happening with these investigations in America today?
Well, this was the interesting thing. The US government had a program back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s known as Project Bluebird, and it was terminated at the end of 1969. And since then, the US government has said, we're not interested in the topic, we no longer investigate. But then in December 2017, the New York Times broke a story, and it was quickly followed by The Post, by Politico, CNN, Fox, NBC, ABC, everyone, essentially revealing that despite the denials, the US government did have a program looking at this, and it was set up by the then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and it was known as ATIP, very cleverly titled because it didn't have anything to do with UFOs in the name of this unit at all. ATIP stands for Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and it was a Pentagon program, so run by the DoD, but actually day-to-day handled by the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, with the further proviso that a lot of the work was actually put out into the private sector to a number of defense contractors. So this is a very interesting development, and this whole story about the Pentagon's UFO program has, in parallel actually with declassification of further files and documents about my old UK Ministry of Defence job, but these two things happening at once have really helped over the last few months to push this subject of UFOs out of the fringe and into the mainstream. I mean, it used to be the case that there was little mainstream media discussion of this, and if there was, it was all a little bit tongue-in-cheek, rolling of eyes, jocular references to little green men and flying saucers. But now there's serious talk, for example, of congressional hearings about all this, and the subject is increasingly cropping up in the mainstream media, and I'm very pleased to have played a part in that.
Over the last 50 years, the UFO area has been considered very fringe. But recently, you've appeared twice on Tucker Carlson. What's happening? Why is this moving into the mainstream right now?
I think it's two things. I think the revelations concerning the Pentagon's UFO program have probably been the primary force at work here. But in parallel in the UK, we are just coming to the end of a 10-year process to declassify and release the MOD's UFO files. And of course, many of those files and documents were ones that I actually wrote. So this is something of a personal blast from the past for me, and I'm been involved personally in that declassification program as a spokesperson for the National Archives, and I've done what I can to keep the subject in the public eye. But I think that the Pentagon revelations are probably the primary factor here. Whether there is anything else going on behind the scenes that has a bearing on this, I don't know. But it seems that the whole subject of UFOs and the parallel subject, perhaps, of the scientific search for extraterrestrial life, whether it's done with space missions or whether it's done through radio astronomy, and more generally the refocusing of interest on space and space exploration, and actually space as part of the modern battlefield. People are saying that in terms of battlefield dominance, of course, the next two important grounds, so to speak, will be outer space and cyberspace. And I absolutely agree with that.
So President Donald Trump is talking a lot about Mars missions and the Space Force. What's behind this, and what are the ramifications of this?
Well, I think that some people have read a lot into this, and they've tried to tie this back to the UFO phenomenon and say maybe the US government knows something about this. All sorts of conspiracy theories, of course, about spaceships hidden away in hangars. I'm not so sure that that's the case. I think it's more a question that the president recognizes the importance of space in terms of future warfare, and knows that the technology is moving ahead so quickly that you have to establish your footprint there if you're to be a player in this. Otherwise, the whole thing slips away from you. And we've seen only too clearly in recent years the way in which the traditional space agencies like NASA and ESA have almost ended up playing second fiddle to the private sector, and in the future it will be doubtless the likes of SpaceX and Bigelow Aerospace and Virgin Galactic. It will be these private sector corporations. It will be the venture capitalists of Silicon Valley. It will be the tech billionaires that end up running this, and not government. So I think the president is quite right to say that the US should be back in the game and leading from the front.
As you mentioned, with the private sector nowadays, we're seeing a range of private companies working on space exploration, such as Elon Musk's SpaceX and Bigelow Aerospace. Do you think they have a major role to play in this? Or is it their involvement is more a way for the government to bypass freedom of information requests?
I think there are several things going on in parallel. Firstly, it's very interesting. This does tie directly back to UFOs, in that the Pentagon's program, ATIP, put a lot of their work out into the private sector. And Bigelow Aerospace was one of a number of different defense and aerospace contractors to pick up some of the contracts here. They're the only ones that we know so far have been involved in this, but there are others, the names of which have not yet found their way into the public sector. One point about this is it's clearly these people like Robert Bigelow, are shrewd business people. They recognize the opportunities here. But so does the DoD and the DIA. And of course, when we're talking about these highly secretive and sensitive programs looking at the UFO phenomenon, whatever we think it is, whatever it may turn out to be, putting some of this work into the private sector makes congressional scrutiny and Freedom of Information Act requests a little bit more difficult. Because not only, if you're looking at FOIA, not only do you have the standard national security exemption that you can kind of fall behind, but you also have the commercial exemption that comes with information which is the property of the private sector. So it gives you a second layer, perhaps, of protection in keeping this away from the public. And it's very interesting. There are literally thousands of FOIA requests in the system at the moment about the Pentagon's UFO program, and most of them are probably going to come back either no records or with the various exemptions sighted. So, but the point remains, the private sector, the Bigelow Aerospaces of this world and others are involved in this. And yes, very much as you said in your question, technology is at the heart of this. These people aren't doing it for just the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because they hope to get something out of it. And technology is a big part of that. One thing that has been revealed over the past few weeks is that Bigelow Aerospace, amongst others, were working on so-called meta materials. The idea that perhaps a better understanding of the UFO phenomenon could help, and there have even been suggestions that there is some recovered material here with isotopic ratio analysis, suggesting that this is not necessarily material that originated here. Now, just as you can tell that, for example, if somebody tries to sell you a rock and tells you it's a meteorite, isotopic ratio analysis can tell you whether that's true, because the differences in the isotopic ratios on Earth as opposed to in space, where there's exposure to various cosmic rays, is something that science can tell us. Well, this sounds like science fiction, but apparently there is some recovered material that's been worked on. Does this come from the Roswell crash, as some people have suggested? I don't know that. I don't know that. But these are exciting times, and people genuinely are working on this. They're also working on technologies, exotic propulsion systems, energy sources, and of course, weaponization is a part of this. And this ties back to my own personal experience of this in the Ministry of Defence. There is a declassified MOD intelligence assessment of the UFO phenomenon, which talks about, quote, novel military applications, unquote, which will derive from a fuller understanding of this. We knew the Russians were looking at this. We knew the Chinese were looking at this. We certainly didn't want them beating us to the punch on it. And we, like the UK, like the US, felt we had to be in the game. We had to. It's the ultimate low probability, high impact scenario, UFOs. Even if you're a complete skeptic, if any of this turns out to be true, the payoff would be immense. I mean, this is literally game-changing, paradigm-shifting territory here. I often used to say at the MOD, the skeptics have to be right every day. The believers only had to be right once. That's the territory that we're in. And we now know through the handful of documents that we have on this, and we know because people like Senator Harry Reid are now saying, okay, yeah, the media reports are true. I can confirm that we were looking at this. We now know that this is true. This is no longer conspiracy theory and fringe science. It's all true.
Yeah, this seems to be an issue that crosses party lines. Both Bill and Hillary Clinton, I believe, were interested in getting more information out. What does politics have to do with this? And is it a bipartisan issue?
Yes, it is. Yes, it's absolutely correct. And you mentioned earlier my two recent appearances on Tucker Carlson Tonight on Fox News. And I saw the other day actually more proof of the way in which this subject has moved from the fringe to the mainstream. Fox News put that clip of my interview, or my second interview, up on YouTube, and in 2 weeks it got over 1 million views. So if ever proof is needed about the transition of this subject from fringe to mainstream, there it is. But yes, going back to your question, this is absolutely not a political issue. I've spoken about this on Fox News, but I've also been on CNN, and President Donald Trump is clearly looking at things like a space force. But the Clintons, as you say, were interested too. I met and briefed back in June of 2011 President Obama's former chief of staff, John Podesta, who went on to run Hillary Clinton's unsuccessful presidential election campaign. I and a number of others briefed Podesta on certainly my direct experience of having looked at this for the British government. I told him one thing that he was particularly interested in was the way in which we reframed the debate about UFOs by dropping the term UFO replacing it with UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. And a couple of years later, I happened to see Hillary Clinton go on Jimmy Kimmel's show, and he was doing a very light-hearted piece on this, but asked her about her interest, which is well known. And she stopped him and said, no, there's a new term. It's not UFO anymore, it's UAP. So I thought that through my briefing of John Podesta back in 2011, I had helped bring that term out. But interestingly, of course, the Pentagon went one better. And with ATIP, they couched this whole program in the language of next generation aerospace technology. I mean, you could look at ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. You could see some of the handful of declassified documents and studies on this, and you could think for all the world that you were looking at people worried about emerging technologies in terms of aircraft, drones, missiles, satellites, etc. And that, of course, is quite deliberate. It's hidden in plain sight.
Without wanting to put you on the spot, what would you suggest that we'll see over the next 5 to 10 years? Will we have big D disclosure, or will it be something else?
I don't know. I retired from the Ministry of Defence in 2006, and although I have some interesting back-channel connections, both with my former UK government employees and with some of the people looking at this in the US, I'm not officially involved in this anymore. I'm someone who perhaps works behind the scenes and does what I can to keep this subject in the public eye through my media appearances. But I don't know where this is going to go. And in terms of disclosure with a big D, well, it depends what there is to disclose. And I don't necessarily have all the answers on that. In one sense, I think we've already had disclosure of sorts. We've had this revelation that despite the denials, the US government was looking at this. We now know the name of the program. We'll probably over the next 5 to 10 years get more of the documentation, more of the studies into this. But I think, whether it's Senator Harry Reid confirming the existence of this, whether it's Bob Bigelow making statements where, for example, he said on 60 Minutes, I don't just believe, I know. Whether it's people like Luis Elizondo, who actually ran the DIA's program and who I met the other day and had a chance to swap notes with about the similarities and the differences between the US and the UK government's program. These people are not whistleblowers. None of us are whistleblowers. We have to be careful, of course. We are only going to talk about material that has either been formally declassified by our respective governments, or material that is unclassified and in the public domain already, perhaps because it was put out into the scientific community and into academia, in part because government, with some of this, has taken it as far as it can and said, well, look, whatever we're dealing with, it's in our airspace. It outmaneuvers certainly our military jets. We've all seen these declassified videos of the Navy jets chasing these objects, whatever they are. So whatever it is, it's here. The real question is, what are we dealing with here? What are as government puts it, what are the threats and what are the opportunities? And I think taking that forward, perhaps with congressional hearings, but perhaps through other forums, I think that's going to be the agenda for the next few years. So I don't think we're going to see a big a single event. I think the UFO community, the conspiracy community, the alternative belief community, whatever you call it, they have this fantasy that one day the president's going to go on television. It's going to be my fellow Americans, people of the world, we are not alone. Well, I don't think it's going to be like that. I think, as I say, it's more this gradual process of, yes, we had a program. Yes, we've got videos of military jets chasing them. Yes, there are scientific papers where we're trying to figure out the propulsion system, the energy source, and can we get any of this figure it out and figure out how to work it ourselves. You know, it's a slow, painful at times, very gradual process, and it's not an area where there are necessarily any quick wins or easy answers. And I recognize that people will be frustrated with that, or some will, but I'm sorry, it's just the way things are. But these are interesting times, and my goodness, we are far further forward now than we were 6 months ago.
Finally, what's on the agenda for Nick Pope? What are you working on right now, and what are you going to be working on in the future?
Well, it's a busy time for me. I'm involved in a wide range of media projects. I will continue to do what I can to keep this subject in the public eye through increasing mainstream media work, whether that's journalism where I write up the features myself or get quoted in stories, or whether it's further TV interviews on chat shows, documentaries, news broadcasts, whatever it may be. And so I'm going to do that. In parallel, I'm certainly going to be doing some behind-the-scenes work with some of the people involved in all this to see if we can't help get past some of the roadblocks. And there are some roadblocks, and do what I can to help move things forward. And on a totally different note, I continue to write some fiction too. So just on a personal front, I mean, this isn't all that I do. I mean, it's interesting, it's important, but I have other projects that I enjoy doing too. For example, I mentioned that my final MOD job was to do with security and counterterrorism. I actually have a thriller coming out in the next couple of months called Blood Brothers, which is about terror attacks in the UK and the intelligence community response to violent jihadist attacks. A little bit politically incorrect, possibly in places, but you know, I'm calling it how I see it, and I hope it generates a lot of interest. And I'm writing a sequel to that called Old Enemies, and I hope obviously to have these novels turned into either movies or TV series. And also I do some consultancy and spokesperson work on a wide range of films, TV shows, video games. So I've got some connections with Hollywood, and that's interesting and fun too. So, you know, I absolutely very much enjoyed my 21 years in the UK Ministry of Defence, but now I live and work here in the United States, and I love that. And it's a different life, and I'm very much enjoying it. Busy on all fronts, and that's absolutely the way to be.
Mr. Nick Pope, thank you very much. Now, you can catch up with Nick Pope and find out what's happening on nickpope.net or on Twitter at nickpopemod. You've been watching Liberty Nation's LNTV. Until next time, take care and stay safe.
Visit us at libertynation.com.